Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of HITRUST Secrets. We are joined today by Mark Sibeli and Justin Graham of Steadfast Partners. We've got a couple new people on the call as well, so welcome to everybody. We talk through all different aspects of HITRUST certification, whether it's your first time through or you're a veteran. And focus today is going to be on kind of talking about vCISOs and then vGRC, so fractional GRC experts and kind of where and when you would plug each of those in. But we can open it up first to anybody who's got any kind of questions if you're going through an assessment right now and any kind of, burning questions you have about HITRUST right now. All right. Well, seeing none, definitely want to introduce my co-host on this, Donna Nodson. Usually we have Jeff McHugh also. He's not able to be here today, but he will be back probably next week, I think, or the week after. But great to see everybody here. I'm going to put in the chat my, Donna, and Jeff's LinkedIn profile. So feel free to connect with us, during this and then afterwards, because even though we meet once a week to talk through things, HITRUST a lot of times doesn't wait for the next week for that. So we definitely want to grow our community. And with that, Donna, did you want to say anything or any kind of intro?
Um, Nothing beyond what you've covered on that part. Just a reminder for some of the new folks. This is a judgment-free zone, so feel free to ask literally any question. I'm sure you are not the first person who's had whatever question you have. And this is also a non-compete space, so we'll just ask everybody to gently keep that in mind.
Perfect. All right. So I want to welcome Justin and Mark. They are Steadfast Partners. And it's funny because Don and I were talking before we started recording today that she and I both have been in touch and had meetings with both these guys through what we do for a living and not necessarily through HITRUST Secrets specifically, but it definitely is a small world of HITRUST compliance. So glad that you guys are on here. If you want to kind of give us a little bit of your background and how you got involved in HITRUST and kind of what you've been doing in the not too distant past.
Go ahead, Justin. I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and kick it off. Thanks for having me, Susan. I've been in the HITRUST game for a while, so it's great to be here on HITRUST Secrets with you. I started out in the HITRUST world as an assessee, right? So working with, it was a healthcare organization based in San Antonio to achieve HITRUST certification, and that really put the bug, in me with HITRUST. From there, I jumped into the consulting side, the external assessor organization piece of the ecosystem. Have led a HITRUST practice for a number of years. Did a small stint on the external assessor council. So been around the game a long time. Very HITRUST friendly. Mark?
Yeah, no, great intro. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Susan, Donna, for having us. Um, I have been in the HITRUST world since, about 8.5 years ago now. I am on the business development side of the house. However, I do have an audit background. I was one of the first Sarbanes-Oxley auditors, fresh out of college. I like to reference that we were the most hated auditors at that time. Probably still can retain that title to this day. But I've always worked on the business development side of the house. And in my previous role, I was brought on to actually boost and build out and develop the HITRUST practice at my previous firm. And that is where Justin and I came into contact and worked together hand in hand to build quite a robust HITRUST and healthcare practice in general. And then we took that knowledge and we saw a couple other opportunities, as we're going to be speaking of today, with the vCISO services and the vGRC engineering services, and said, hey, let's go and do that on our own. It's time. We've been wanting to do it. In our previous firm, we worked 5 years together, and we probably were on our own majority of the time, I would venture to say. So we built out a couple service lines. We obviously built out the healthcare practice. Justin also built out the federal practice. So a lot of experience, a lot of years dedicated to HITRUST specifically, though.
Perfect. Yeah, and we have a huge number of people. We've got a lot of people on the call today, which is fabulous. And please, if you have any questions as we're going through this discussion, this is meant to be a discussion, not necessarily a presentation. So by all means, jump in, either raise a hand or just, interrupt at a good time and just let us know what questions you have. But I do want to start kind of with what you're seeing, because it wasn't until we had this conversation probably 2 or 3 weeks ago that I started thinking about, because I always kind of, look at, well, vCISO, and that's really the fractional thing that you would do with any kind of information security role. And then you guys actually coined the phrase vGRC. I remember I stumbled over, and I still stumble over the acronym, but it really drove home for me the fact that, yes, there are companies, especially small, medium businesses, that don't necessarily need a full-time compliance expert. But, and Donna and I use the phrase audit Sherpa a lot of times with helping people get through that. But this really kind of makes it a little bit more formal and kind of, but still has a distinction between, what somebody in that role would do versus a traditional, what people think of as vCISO role. Do you kind of want to expand upon that?
Yeah, Susan, I'll take that. So I want to go back in time just a little bit, and I think it's important to highlight where the concept of vGRC came from. So if you can imagine, I was in the position of running a HITRUST practice. Mark mentioned I was also running a federal practice, so a lot of audit work. And as an auditor, and for anybody who's listening who's an auditor, you probably agree that we have that unique perspective of being able to look under the hood of a lot of organizations to see what kind of infrastructure they're running, what the security stack looks like. It's a unique position. And one thing that caught my attention over the last 2 years specifically is the very high adoption rate of automated GRC platforms. So, we're very vendor agnostic, right? Of course. But, examples, I guess the big players in the industry would be your Dradas, your Vantas, your Secure Frames, ThoroPass even. We're seeing everybody adopting this technology. And, that really caught my attention. But where vGRC was born was from another observation. And what that would be is that this is coming more from a vCISO perspective. So I also served in a vCISO capacity. Whenever we would onboard with a customer or a client and they would mention, yeah, we have this technology, your first thought is awesome. Like they get compliance, they're doing it. But when you actually get in and you look at their GRC instance, it's in terrible shape. Right. So, generally the way this works is you would onboard into a tool like this. You would assign, your security team access. You would integrate it with your security stack. And that's really the concept of this software is through integration. So it's going to integrate with your cloud environment, AWS, GCP. It's going to integrate with your endpoint solution, your MDM solution. And it's going to, in real time, be able to report back on statistics on your compliance status. It's a CISO's best friend, right? It's direct visibility into your compliance status in real time, right? It's amazing technology. But we're seeing that nobody's managing this right? So, I mean, it's once you get these integrations in place, you layer in a framework on top of that, whether it be HITRUST, E1, I1, R2, SOC 2, fill in the blank. It's a lot of work, right? So they're very task-based systems. I think one of the major selling points to GRC automation platforms is this concept of automated evidence collection, which is fantastic. I love it. But that's really going to be focused on your technical infrastructure. And as we all know, as practitioners, you're going to be dealing with both technical and non-technical controls. So if you think about HITRUST, you have your 19 domains. Not all of those are technical in nature. So you're not going to be able to automatically go out and get evidence of, let's say, an independent review of the security program. Somebody still has to be assigned that task. Somebody has to execute that task. So long story short, we're seeing a lot of organizations struggle here, right? They're not assigning owners to these tasks, integrations are broken, and that was the light bulb moment. And Mark and I looked and we said, you know what? Let's take this philosophy of a fractional CISO and apply that to the GRC world, right? And that's kind of where the concept of vGRC came from.
Yeah, because I think otherwise, a lot of times you spend that money on a tool and it becomes a policy document repository.
Right.
And that's really all you use it for is, okay, we've got our policies up there. And maybe we throw some procedures in, but typically your procedures live where the people are that need to use those procedures. So you're typically in Jira or Confluence or something like that, where you're putting that information. And that's why I'm always skeptical when I see somebody that says, oh, we can fully automate your HITRUST certification for you for that exact reason. You're like, really, it's integrating with a paper visitor log? How exactly is that happening?
Mm-hmm.
But I see, you invest all this in a tool unless you have somebody managing and knowing how to move it past pulling the policy documents in and, maybe a user access agreement now and then. It's difficult to kind of get that full advantage out of those tools.
Yes. And
it reminds me back to when Microsoft launched MS Project and people were looking at MS Project and they were looking at, the MS Project as a kind of evolved into the cloud-based platform and how it could manage resources and everything else. And I was actually part of a consultancy at that point in time that would go in after they bought the tool and realized it wasn't going to solve all their project management problems because they didn't have a process. And you have to plug in a process. You have to plug in information in order to make it work for you. And it has to be the right process. It has a good process. So those are the types of things I'm seeing with a lot of the GRC, tools as they buy this. And out of the box isn't really a term used anymore, but it feels like that's what they're expecting, is that you just turn it on out of the box and it's going to do magic things.
Exactly. I always equated it to when my husband and when our kids were little, we ended up going to Home Depot or Lowe's and buying the playground kit. And I was like, oh, it's going to have exactly what we need. And it's just, it's going to have all the wood and everything. And it's just it's going to put together like IKEA furniture. And it isn't. It's a slide and it's some swings but it's okay. Well, now work with your builder to figure out what wood you need, how big you're going to make this, which direction this is going. And I was like, I thought a playground kit was a do-it-yourself playground kit. And a lot of times these GRC tools are very much the same. You need somebody to kind of go, okay, well, how are you going to put it on how are you going to cite it in your organization and who's going to use it and who's, what, to your point, what processes do you have that you want to include in this workflow? And if you don't have any, you're kind of lost because there's no, okay, here's the first 2 or 3 easy, workflows, pick one. There isn't any of that. It's really just the building blocks.
I think too, organizations underestimate like how much effort it really takes to fully build out this technology to get the most value out of it. Especially once you layer in like a framework on top of the technical integrations. If you're looking at the HITRUST framework, roughly 50% of it is going to pull in for you automatically. But again, that other 50% is it's a big chunk. And one piece of advice that I share, it really depends if you're going like where you're at in your HITRUST lifecycle. But if you're an organization and you see the benefits of using this automated GRC technology and you want to put that out on a timeline, like what would be the ideal time to implement this software? Right after an audit is the sweet spot, right? Because if you think about how you go in to seed one of these platforms, you can rely back on a lot of your evidence, right? So, thinking about, all of the quarterly reviews, all the annual assessments, all of that evidence, you already have it in place, you already have it correlated, and you can link that to where it needs to go. It's kind of the shortcut, but on the other side of the fence, if you're not already like in an audit cycle and you're starting it new, then it's just more of like an awakening, like, wow, we've got a lot of work to do. So that's where vGRC comes in to help. So you have a fractional GRC analyst to help you seed it, to help you build it out, to help you get it up to a place where you can get the most ROI out of this investment as soon as possible.
Well, and I also see the role not just working with an automated tool, but also kind of being that facilitator to help people understand how to best evidence things. Because, as I go through assessments, a lot of times you'll see, people that they're fully implemented, but it's difficult to prove that out. And with a report, with a compliance report or a dashboard or something like that, it kind of helps make it easier for them so that they don't have to keep sending you that information manually. And so I even see that role kind of expanding so that even if you don't have an automated system, you still can get the benefit of putting somebody in that role in addition to, or, instead of that vCISO. Because maybe your
Well,
controls are in place, but you just don't have any way of telling that story.
I would actually say it would be in addition to a vCISO because while there are areas where they connect, there's also a lot that's quite separate.
Mhm.
Because the GRC is something that I was very directly responsible for at a prior organization who also had a CISO. And the GRC component was something where my role then expanded and covered ESG. I mean, let's just throw some more acronyms in there. But those are the types of things that a vGRC, for example, would be a great fit for.
Mhm.
Looking across the organization where some of these things come up in, assessments and audits where, how much are you trying to reduce your green footprint, and, what does your supply chain look like if you're working with, offshore components. They're starting to really increase the regulations around that, and companies need to be heads up because it'll be like a data point in an assessment or an audit. And it's not necessarily going to be the focus, but it'll catch you off guard because if you don't have the information or you're not on the right side of that information, it will be something where you can suddenly find yourself in a rather uncomfortable audit position. And that's not just in the security audits either. The financial audits, depending on if it's a publicly traded company and that sort of thing, are really getting into this. So I think a vGRC role is a really strong role for a lot of organizations going forward. So in addition to the CISO, I'll leave that there. That's it's been rattling around in my head over the past few weeks.
No,
Yeah.
that's a good point. And I was just going to say, it's not about necessarily coming in and filling that security leadership role. And that's why we created this vGRC, was to actually support the CISO or even a fractional CISO if they already have one in place, to get through these types of audit seasons, to help with that automation and to really gain that visibility into the environment and start to build out the dashboards and the meaningful KPIs so that they can report up and have real-time feedback on their current compliance status.
Yeah, and I feel too that this role, whether it's fractional or you bring GRC in-house, it's becoming a much more technical role,
Yeah.
right? So you don't have to lean into investing in GRC automation technology. There's the concept of GRC engineering now, where you can go out and monitor your controls through technical means, right? Writing scripts to have continuous monitoring of your environment. So it's becoming much more of a technical role. And even with this GRC automation technology, like you have to dive into what that evidence looks like, right? Like they all tout automated evidence collection, but what does that look like? Essentially, what that looks like for most of these are just like JSON text scripts. So, you have to have like the technical know-how to look at this, config or this code to say, okay, that meets this high trust requirement. I was very skeptical when I first started seeing this technology. I was running a high trust practice, and we're looking, go take screenshots. We're not used to like reviewing code. So it is more technical in nature. And, in my role as leading high trust practice, of course, I had great relationships with the high trust assurance team. And that was a common conversation, like, hey, like we know, these automated, evidence collection platforms, like, what are you seeing with these? Like, is this evidence good? And they were like, yeah, there's no problems with it. Like, we understand it. Yes, it is code based, it's JSON based, but we understand it and it shows the implementation of the controls. So it's a different look, right? You're looking at direct configs, through API connections, and you're not looking at traditional screenshots. And I think the GRC analyst or GRC engineer of the future is going to have to get a little more technical to really keep up.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's difficult to be technical in network, in transmission, in the application, the code, to be able to look at all of those different aspects of it and still have that technical expertise to know, yes, this network diagram does show this, or this procedure does match to say this is how I am configuring this. And so, yeah, to lend itself with the technology. What surprises me are, that I don't see, AWS or Azure kind of assisting with that. I don't see, like, AWS is great with Artifact and with Security Hub, but I don't see them going, hey, let's automate some of this evidence collection for you because all of your stuff is here and, we can very easily do that. So some of it for me is, boy, wouldn't it be great to partner with one of them and say, could you just give me a report or a dashboard that had these aspects in it so that I can say, auto run has been disabled, as opposed to, okay, which menu item in Entra does that, or Intune or Defender, or, well, it could be this or it could be this. Well, it'd be nice if it was, if Microsoft did that and said, oh, you're not using application defender, you're using, Intune for that or something, based on that, so that they could kind of help you with, yes, autoplay, or, we're not autoplaying macros. And here's how you've defended that. And there's 4 different configurations that would meet that, but they know their tool well enough to be able to say, yes, this is how you do it, as opposed to, okay, well, let me go in this client and look here. Well, no, that's not how they're doing it, but there's 4 different ways to solve that problem.
I
Yeah,
mean, we could play a full game of wouldn't it be nice if Microsoft, and that could
Yeah.
take a whole hour conversation.
Well,
But
because
I mean,
it goes into that technical where you have to be technical in Azure, you have to be technical in Google, you have to be technical in AWS, and it can be very difficult to find that right fit, because you don't want to say, no, I don't know how to do that. But at the same time, you're like, okay, it's going to take me a minute because, they call it this in AWS, and I'm real familiar with it here, but they call it this in a different tool.
yeah, but I mean, there's so many efficiencies to be gained. Like, even using that AWS as an example, like, if you had to go in as a security practitioner and audit, let's say, the encryption status of your S3 buckets, like traditionally, like you would have to log in to AWS and look at each bucket and is this flagged and how many AWS accounts do I have? Do I have, 20 different AWS accounts? Like, that takes forever. Where, they're opening up that technology to integrations to be able to, continuously monitor that. And that's really that concept of GRC engineering, where you're setting rules, like, hey, let's just force these S3 buckets to be encrypted by default, and you're just monitoring for non-compliance.
Right. And they'll answer that with a policy. We'll put a
Yeah,
policy in place that says if somebody switches that, then I alert and I either maybe I notify somebody that they've done it and let it go, or I say, nope, sorry, against policy.
yeah,
But it's a hard time understanding and kind of staying ahead of that,
yeah,
and getting ahead of what those different policy rules would be.
yeah. That's true.
Yeah, because when I've brought that up to AWS in the past, they've been like, "Well, just write a policy for that." I'm like, "Oh, sure, okay. Let me go to training and figure out how to write policies for all this stuff."
And
well, I mean, I
this is
think you're
also
touching
where I
on.
feel
Oh,
like the GR. Oh, sorry, Mark, you want to jump in?
no, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, this is where I feel like the GRC role is incredibly helpful, going above and beyond the CISO role, which is, appropriately and heavily technical. And this is also where, if you're looking at an organization dividing where the evidence comes from, as opposed to who's running the internal, kind of high trust project or assessment. That would be a very nice division. CISO over here, they're the ones who are responsible for implementing and managing on a regular basis. GRC over on this side, either reporting CFO or COO, something like that. So it's, proper division. And then really looking at it, because their role could be more about being familiar with evidence on the kind of prove it to me side of the house versus, yes, I know it's implemented. I did it myself. That's good, but that's not the appropriate proper division.
Yeah, but I think you just touched on it. That's the evolution that we're seeing right now, and that's the current trend of GRC kind of coming into its own and stepping into a bigger role in that reporting mechanism, and not just that, but in that engineering mechanism as well. So you have to have that technical know-how to be not only a successful GRC engineer, but I think a successful auditor as well, because you have to understand those processes and how they're put into place.
Yeah, you've got to break down like the G, the R, and the C.
Yeah.
Like as a vCISO, like you've got to like lead with risk management, right? So you're really nailing that R. But from the compliance aspect and the high trust compliance and the continuous monitoring and the automated tool, that's more compliance based, I feel. So it is a different look. The compliance automation feeds risk management, to some degree. So you're able to identify risks in different areas where you might not be able to. But really the reporting that, automated GRC platforms provide is a CISO or fractional CISO's best friend. It's, knowing real time, like what is my current security posture look like across multiple domains. Like that is so valuable to have at your disposal, as a security leader.
Is anybody allowed to talk? Or just
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, jump in.
Good. So, yeah, I agree with a lot that you're saying as far as the new automated GRC tools. I think they're great because they kind of put structure around chaos a little bit, But one of the things that I think is critically important is the fact that if we go into a role like this, or whether it's a vGRC or a vCISO, is truly understanding what governance and risk means. And you can throw a tool in there and add a bunch of policies to it, but you could still have a disastrous governance program. A governance program where there's no communication, there's no board level or executive level understanding of business risk. So when we talk about risk and governance, we talk about bridging the divide between security and executive leadership, and also empowering executive leadership to understand how and why cybersecurity risk is business risk. So to me, it's a lot more going into engagement like that. Again, whether it's vGRC or vCISO, it's easy to throw a tool in and say, okay, we're going to throw a compliance thing on there. Now we have governance and risk, but it's a lot more to be able to identify those gaps in that governance space and the risk space. How are you calculating risk, and how are you determining your risk levels, and how are you communicating that risk is most important, and where I see the biggest gap in the industry.
Interesting. Yeah. And I know, a lot of CISOs struggle with how can they be all the different roles they need to have. So I think it's important that we are kind of seeing there's now that split and that distinction. And Donna, you were thinking, well, what would the reporting structure look like? And to me, as we were kind of going through this discussion, to me, I look at that vGRC going through maybe the legal team, because it is looking at regulatory, compliance and making sure that the business is operating in a legal fashion, versus the CISO, which could be more of an operational role because, information security risk is operational risk. And so, maybe that's where, because I go through and see, CISO roles that are posted and they want everything. And you can always tell who wrote that job description based on whether it leads with, I need you to do a bunch of compliance work. Oh, and by the way, I also need you to lead our SOC, and I need you to do all the patch management and the vulnerability management. Or if it starts with, you're going to run our SOC and our vulnerability and patching. Oh, and by the way, I need you to also, successfully complete all these audits and make sure that the governance piece is there as well. So I think it is more than one person could handle in a role. So I do think it's important to see kind of that distinction moving forward.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, if there is a chief legal officer, then that could be an area of the business. I think I've seen more situations where that type of governance and risk management is handled under either the CFO or the COO. But if they have a CLO, then that's certainly an option. If the chief legal officer wants to cover that, it can go both ways. Sometimes the chief legal officers are there and extremely client contract focused, and that is their like 90% of what they do. So it just depends on their kind of breadth and focus.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
But the whole
Susan,
supply chain kind of makes it, they kind of also have to look through that piece of it as well, the vendors.
They do, but I've been surprised about how many chief legal officers don't cover vendors. They don't cover vendor contracts more than a sniff test. Maybe that's just the situations that I've come across, but they're by and large focused on, my experience has
Not
been
getting
that they're
sued by
more
by
focused
their
on
customers. Yeah.
customer contracts rather than vendors. But, what are other folks' experience?
I think one interesting aspect of this technology that we're talking about when it comes to vendor risk is the ability, or there's modules built out that a lot of these organizations deploy in their tools in the form of trust center technology. So if you think about an automated GRC tool, it's going out and it's monitoring your controls in real time, and you're able to externally publish, selectively, so your customers can actually see your compliance status in real time. And I think that trust center technology is really changing the game in vendor risk management. You're able to, post your HITRUST certification report out there if you want to. Again, it's whatever you want to, but it's kind of interesting and cool to kind of see that change and how this technology is changing, TPRM as well.
I think Microsoft would agree with most of us that they would like to see fewer questionnaires as well as part of third-party risk management, but just going out on a limb there. I was on a panel with Microsoft a few years ago, and I said, how do you get the questionnaires to stop? Surely Microsoft knows that the answer to this, right? They've got their things. They just seem so big. How many people would send questionnaires? You've only got 2 or 3 other options, and it basically depends on what you're doing and what you're already using. And the gentleman said, no, he said, we still have a whole department dedicated to questionnaires. I said, are you serious? He goes, I wish I could get them to stop. So,
yeah, and
another day.
yeah, and yeah, Susan, I think another area that's like very interesting, when we're talking about this technology and how that impacts, HITRUST and organizations that are going for HITRUST is like it's fundamentally changed audit. Like this new technology, like it's the first time like innovation has come to audit in a long time. So traditionally, if you're an organization and you want to go the HITRUST route, it's a 3-step process. I mean, you have to do your readiness work up front, a gap assessment, find out what the problems are. The phase 2 would be remediation or fix the problems identified, and then you go to your audit. But this technology has kind of blended phase 1 and phase 2 in that you can implement this technology, it'll automatically go out and get your compliance status. And when you lay that framework on top, you can think of it as providing you a real-time readout of a readiness type assessment. And as long as you have the expertise and you're completing these tasks appropriately, you know when you're ready for audit because everything lights up green, right? So it's really changing the game. And I'm seeing on the external assessor side, the audit side, a lot of these organizations are getting very tuned in on this technology and are able to leverage auditor access into these platforms to streamline that audit collection process, which we know is, very time consuming and tedious. So again, it's just really cool to see this innovation and the way that it's changing HITRUST.
Yeah, and that's a huge benefit that I'm
Yeah.
finding is that the auditors have an integration into those platforms, like you just said. So rather than providing the evidence, collecting the evidence, providing the evidence ad hoc, they actually have a connection into the platform where they can pull the evidence themselves. So that's, to me, is a huge benefit.
What an efficiency, right? I mean,
Yeah.
think about that when you're talking to a potential client and they're considering whether to go an automation route or not. I mean, giving them that type of feedback of how the workflow is going to adjust or change for them is powerful because then they don't have to look at audit and the HITRUST audit as their full-time job for that X amount of months or weeks, whatever it is that it takes to pull all that stuff together and bother their engineers and bother everyone through all the different departments to get the screenshots that they need.
Yeah, and you don't have to sit on calls for hours saying, okay, well, here's this document, here's my diagram, here's this.
Correct.
They just pull everything. You get on a call, they go through all the evidence with you that they pulled from the platform. So I think it's pretty cool.
Correct. Which, to that point with the vGRC, that's kind of the role that we're looking at, that we created. It's like someone needs to maintain all of those systems, workflows, and the data sources within that automation tool. So that management over time allows that to be, the connectivity to it all to continue to seamlessly integrate into the GRC tool for that output.
And if it's going off what Mark's saying, that's where vGRC comes in, because it's also important to have a vGRC analyst who can interpret HITRUST and speaks HITRUST, right? So it's one thing to go at this at your own, like, is this artifact that I'm uploading into my tool really appropriate and meet the HITRUST requirement, where if you have like an actual HITRUST assessor reviewing that documentation and doing it for you, you have that extra level of assurance that, like, when it comes time to audit season, like, yeah, we're going to nail it. So it kind of takes, that expertise of, interpreting like, illustrative procedure type language, out of the picture. So.
Now, I would actually lay down a bit of a challenge because I have yet to see a tool that would take away even half the work of the internal person who oversees HITRUST assessment. Because this is, many of the times that's what I'm called in to do, because the organization is either too small, they don't have somebody dedicated to that, and they need somebody who can come in and run the assessment from the inside, not taking the place of an assessor. And because I don't have an assessor license, that's deliberate on my part, then it kind of dovetails very well into the situation. And then I work with the assessors in a role that the assessors can't do because they have to keep an arm's length distance. But I have yet to see a tool, and I will continue looking, but I have yet to see a tool that can eliminate the majority of that work. And
I think something that's really interesting. Yeah, something that's really interesting on that front. You've probably seen. We all follow, the HITRUST press releases, and they've picked a small number of these technology providers and provided integration, between the GRC platform and myCSF. And what that allows for, as that evidence is collected and gathered within the GRC platform, automatically push into myCSF. So I think that's another efficiency that's going to be gained, right? Somebody has to do that work, and just opening it up an API and pushing that out just makes it so much more streamlined and efficient. But you're back to your point. You're right. These tools are really good at the technical stuff. and people underestimate how much effort that non-technical stuff really is in the world of HITRUST.
Yeah, and I guess that's my question is, I mean, are you seeing people adopt this for an E1 or an I1 where the focus is strictly on the implementation of the control more so than having a policy and having written procedures? Because that's the part I just don't know you could fully automate the gathering of procedures or storing them there because that's typically not where they're going to live. And how do you program a tool to go out and find procedure documents that would support something? So are you really seeing that this right now is kind of the E1, I1, and that's really where?
Primarily, and what you also have to take in consideration that the E1, the I1 are static in nature.
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
if you're developing a tool and you have to layer in a framework, it's very difficult to layer in the R2 framework.
Exactly.
No two are the same. So
Mhm.
yeah, the
Yeah, even
E1
from
and
year to year. I
yeah,
mean, because working from somebody that 2 years ago got HITRUST certified, even with the number, the control number the same, a lot of times that language is a little bit different, or it'll say, furthermore, do this,
Yeah.
this, and this. And that's okay, that's an 11.5
yeah,
update,
Yeah.
and this person was on 9.6 or something like that before.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
would say
see
that
clients get very excited when they're like, oh, I've only got 20 more controls. No, pause. You actually have 180 control deviation because they deleted these so they could change them fundamentally and then added all these.
Right. Well, and even if they kept the
And
same
it's
number,
heartbreaking for them.
yeah, even if they kept the same number, they may have added more specifics in that illustrative procedures to say, in addition to what we said before, here's two more components that you need to evaluate.
Yeah.
and there's one more piece of this that I find fascinating. In with HITRUST, it takes a lot to operate your security program over time, right?
Mhm.
So usually with an R2, what I would do with a client is create a run book. Okay, so these are all the things I need to be doing on either a weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually basis. You'd often see people setting, Outlook reminders to make sure they do that. This is a way to automate that. So through these tools, generally it's a task-based system, and you assign an owner and you can assign due dates. And as the compliance manager or the person overseeing HITRUST, you can go in and look in real time, like, did somebody forget this, or what's missing? One of the pitfalls that I see with R2, once you've been through it 2 or 3 times, like sometimes those little tasks, like an assessment, needs to be done on an annual basis. Sometimes those drop off because nobody is putting the attention, or they don't have that in an email reminder to make sure they do that. Or maybe whoever was doing that left the company and nobody picked up that process. So it's just a way to organize and manage your security program. And I think with HITRUST just is so rigorous, that level of oversight on how everything's working, what's due, what's past due, is very important.
Yeah, and I've seen that more in a continuous monitoring system, more so than what I would traditionally call a GRC, like a
Mhm.
Keylight or an Archer, with that piece of it. But yeah, I definitely agree that you definitely need that. And there's some controls that are 3 years, that at least once every 3 years you do something. And, good luck putting that in a calendar and remembering what the heck that was. And and I see people at that point trying to find, okay, well, we moved from, we migrated, so did we officially, create an authority to operate or authorization to operate, and did we have somebody in senior management, and that go no go discussion actually
Mhm.
approve this, even though maybe it wasn't a 3-year anniversary of, we did this, but 18, 19 months in, we migrated. And so therefore the clock started over again on that 3-year thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
No,
think
I
we
often
did,
encourage.
when we were doing our high trust programs over at our previous firm, we
Mhm.
we did a good job of, because I think an element of this that we don't talk about necessarily is client training, right? Client culture shift is not looking at this as just a one-time audit and then go out and celebrate and party, be like, hey, we're through audit season. It's no, this is a program and it's run
Mhm.
continuously throughout the year. Even in your off year, you still have your interim, right? So we're still
Mhm.
doing things moving every step of the way. And with Justin creating those run books and starting to have people get assimilated to, okay, this is a program. Okay, what do we do in this quarter? What do we do in this quarter? What do we have to do in the second half of the year? So on and so forth, has really helped move to that continuous assurance type of um, mindset, I guess. And now it's becoming more of a reality. And the GRC tooling, that automation tooling, is allowing those run books to kind of play out um, more in more of a streamlined efficiency, so that people are actually seeing it. It's more than just a calendar reminder. It becomes part of the process of obtaining and maintaining high trust over time. And I think with high trust shift into this continuous assurance model, we're going to see more and more of that going, because I think that's where we're going with audits anyways. The point in time assessments no longer holding the weight that they used to hold in traditional audit. So the shift is very real, and it's happening, and we're trying to stay ahead of that curve.
Yeah, it's really interesting to take a peek outside of the high trust lane into what FedRAMP's doing with that 20X program, because that's all built on KSIs and continuously monitoring controls. So like, if you're an organization, like high trust provides the highest level of assurance you can possibly get, but at the end of the day, it's still a point in time assessment. So like, how much assurance would that be if I'm able to report out in real time what my compliance status is? So we're not there yet, but I kind of feel like that continuous assurance is kind of the direction everything's moving towards. It's very difficult to get there, but I kind of see that in the future.
Yeah, we talked about that a couple weeks ago, where it was like, okay, you get your high trust certification. Day 1, celebrate. Day 2, recover from the celebration. Day 3, start planning for the next one. And I do think, when high trust does come out with their continuous assurance program next year, they are going to try to get rid of some of that, high mountain climb, and then lot of period of inactivity, high mountain climb, and really force you into more of that quarterly, continue the program and don't lose sight of it, which automation is going to then be even more important, because otherwise you're going to, not just have a person that you bring in once every 6 months or once every 18 months, you're going to be bringing them in every quarter. And so you're going to want to have that automation. So I see it as an expanding industry.
Yeah, it's definitely TBD as far as the level of effort that's going to be required to, deliver the ongoing assurance, where high trust is testing those waters. They said starting in Q1, right? 2026?
Yep, by the end of Q1. And I think it'll start E1 first, which makes sense. 44 controls and implementation only focused is a very good way to start. And then, expand that out to the I1, and then maybe potentially to the R2. But, kind of drives that conversation we've had a while back also is, well, if you're doing this I1, do you ever need to go to an R2? At what point do you decide that you definitely need that? If you can do an I1 or a combined assessment, with the factors that you need, would you ever want to go into that full-on R2? And if your data breach rate is still
published breach rate,
well, if your published breach rate is still 99.9% with no matter what, no matter which one you're doing, which again, I agree with you, Don. I think we're going to start seeing that deviate as more people over time, have an E1 that those hopefully not, but that those are probably going to have a more increased breach rate. But you look at it, it's funny, I always look at every control of the domains. Domain 11, access control, is the one that has the most number of controls, no matter what size assessment you've got with high trust. So it tells me over and over again that, user credentials are still the big way to get in and breach a company.
Yeah. Domain 11 is always, honestly, it's the one I tackle first, because once I deal with it, then everything else is easier.
Exactly. You're like, okay, if you can't get this, there's no point. Shore this up first, and then everything else is gonna feel easy after this. As you're slogging through, 21 of your 44 controls. No, it's not that many, but it feels like it in E1.
I feel like you're gonna see like a true tiering of organizations maturity with the R2 versus the I1. A lot of people won't take that step until they're well into an enterprise level, just because, the changing dynamics of the R2 year over year. They're not going to be able to tackle that on a continuous assurance front. But I think you're going to see that the R2s, the ones that do take it on, those enterprises, those organizations, are going to be very, very mature. And it's going to be a sign of real assurance into the marketplace of, okay, they're able to actually move this. They have a program that has agility in place to be able to handle the complexity of this type of a compliance standard.
Yeah, it's a pretty big jump from E1 to I1. I think looking at the documentation, I love the graphic that HITRUST provides on the percentage of MITRE threat sources that are protected by each of the E1, the I1, and the R2. Just from a straight threat perspective, that that I1 level has the coverage that you need. The E1, it's the fundamentals.
Correct.
But
Yep.
I mean, the I1 is more rigorous than a lot of people think. It's very in depth, and you get a lot of maturity in your program if you successfully implement that control set, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in some of these I1s assessments, for readiness assessment, feeling like I'm in an R2 and having to pull myself back and go, oh, wait, I don't need a policy document for all of these. Because you start going through that domain and you're like, oh, I don't have a policy that says it. You're like, oh, wait, I just have to worry about the implementation. This one does not require a policy. So I do feel that sometimes because, you're at 182 controls. What's another 50, 60 at that point? And then you're in the
Yeah, and
R2.
I think it's a good example within that I1 framework of when you think about the technical versus non-technical and the areas where this new GRC technology really shine. Physical security is a non-technical control. And I think in the I1, a lot of people are surprised really at the rigor in that domain 18 physical security. Like it's pretty substantial. Well, given most organizations rely on inheritance through their cloud service provider, but if you actually have an on-prem data center and
Exactly.
you look at that list, like it's kind of eye-opening. So
Oh, yeah.
that's an area that I would call a non-technical control, where you still have to do some work to be able to get to the point to continuously monitor those controls. It takes manual efforts, right? So I think that's a good
Flood
example.
management, fire management.
Yeah.
Onboarding,
basic
offboarding.
windows
Yeah.
impact. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you don't want to pull that type of information in. You don't want to pull your HR information into a GRC tool. I like that wall in between with, okay, it's not until it's redacted that it comes into my evidence collection.
Yeah, and there's different flavors. Like with this technology, like there are some tools that do integrate with HR systems, and it's this whole spectrum where it's a very niche market. So some of this technology is geared more towards startups and very small companies. And that's where you might see an integration with your HR system to get like that source of truth for all your employees. But I mean, it's a whole spectrum. And on the enterprise side, that's where you're going to get integrations with like ServiceNow. So it'll automatically cut tickets to your teams into established processes and everything in between. And like we've, through with Mark and I, like we have experience navigating a lot of these. And that's another kind of nuance with this technology is you have to select the right vendor to match your specific business objectives because it varies completely from provider to provider, and you have to find that one that's a good fit.
Yeah, and even speaking on ServiceNow, I mean, they have their own GRC tool, and it's an enterprise level tool that we've seen scale well with some organizations, some enterprises, and fail miserably with others, just because of the perceived plug and play nature of it, right? And they didn't realize what the actual lift was going to be. But we've also seen in larger organizations, like you were mentioning earlier on the financial aspects with Sarbanes-Oxley and other things, we see GRC programs that are maturing that will take a tool that serves GRC automation for security and risk management alone and allow and say, okay, well, finance, do your thing. Do you want Workiva? Take Workiva, but that doesn't translate into a very functional GRC security tool. So you're seeing it all over the map, and you have these, sometimes these tools are layered on top of one another as well, because they serve different functions within the business.
Yeah, and that's where my frustration continues to lie because in so many of the assessments and audits, there are overlapping evidence requirements, and to me, it's incredibly frustrating that yes, the finance audit has a bunch of stuff that the high trust audit won't, or it's not required for some of the other security assessments, but there is a significant amount of overlap, and I find it very frustrating that that you got tools, addressing one or the other, but to try to marry them up is an incredibly, at least right now, it's an incredibly manual and laborious, effort where a lot of people look and say, is it worth it? Or do I just keep on keeping on? Because sometimes, I don't know, I suspect a lot of those folks look now and go, well, it's not available right now, but it probably will be in 2 years. And that'll take me that long to get it all in place. So maybe they're just waiting.
Well, and that's a good point is, how do you start with automating some of this? I mean, do you start with the things that happen every quarter or every month? Do you look at the things that are more static that are, not necessarily a sample, but, how would you begin to do this? Because you can't, even with an I-1, you can have 182 controls and automate them all at the same time. So kind of, how do you advise people to get started with something like this?
Yeah, it's again going back. I think my first piece of advice, if you're thinking about going the route to implement this kind of technology, if you have the opportunity to put it on your roadmap directly after an audit, that's the easy button. That's the quick button to get your tool to a very high degree of maturity in a short amount of time. Outside of that, I think if you want to make start dicing it up and, okay, I want to use automation to stand up these areas first as a test run before these areas. Obviously, the technical side is going to be the easy button, right? Because it's going to automatically go out and be pulling and monitoring those for you in real time. The tricky part of, and where GRC engineering comes into play, is being able to automate the non-technical controls, right? And there's usually processes around that, that you have to either write scripts for, be able to manage file repositories to look for deviations and changes with the expectation that a new artifact, that meets that control requirement might be dropped in there in the future and be monitoring for that. Technical side is much easier, honestly, with automation. Once you get your hands wrapped around that, it kind of makes the non-technical administrative stuff a little bit easier to comprehend, I would say.
So kind of like vulnerability management, configuration management, maybe even user access control at that point, and kind of start with those and see how that helps. And
I think those are great examples.
okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
And the vuln management is a big piece to this.
Well, yeah, your inventory of assets
Yeah.
is huge. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's always like, well, I have it here and here and here, and
Yeah.
I don't want to pull it, and you're like, I don't need it in a spreadsheet wherever you're holding it, because obviously your AWS information is not going to be in the same place as your laptops. I get that, and I don't want you to put together a spreadsheet that's going to be static. Just show me where you're pulling all that information, and we'll go from there. So that's probably inventory of assets is probably the first step, other than policy documents, because that's the easy one.
Yeah.
Throw your policy documents in there and forget about them.
And how would you guide? I know we're just right at the top of the hour here, so I'll throw one last question. How would you guide, kind of focus on automation versus those controls that have sample selections? Because I feel like the sample selections probably throw a bit of a kind of widget in the system, and that's where there is an obligation not to provide more than necessary to the assessors. And that comes in especially heavy when you're talking about personnel records and that type of thing. So how do you guide, that automation process when you're talking about areas of evidence where you shouldn't provide more than whatever comes up in the sample selection, which you won't know till later?
I would say not being in the role of an external assessor anymore, I would pivot to your auditor to get guidance. But this is how I would answer that, just be specifically, is you're right. You don't want to be in a position where you provide too much, right? But at the end of the day, if you're monitoring your controls in real time and you know that you're at 100% compliance, the risk factor of oversupplying evidence drops a little bit. Also, there are some things that Ryan Patrick put out. Actually, he's a great resource at HITRUST, talking about ways to provide, sampling a bit before the 90-day period, and you're able to look at one example during the audit. Using that philosophy for your sampling on this automated collection makes a lot of sense. So I would check that out, what Ryan, his comments on there, and that's kind of would be the guide on how I think you could best navigate that.
Yeah, and I know there are some things that if it's an automated control, you don't necessarily have to pick a sample because you know you're at 100% compliant. So it's one of those things like if you can prove that nobody can get around this, then a lot of times you can say, well, it's an automated control, so therefore, I do that with the fact that Microsoft has their Outlook app on a phone. So you typically, if that's the only way that you're allowing people in on mobile devices, then you can say, well, I'm letting Microsoft handle that piece of it as far as getting that information back off of a computer once that, so I don't necessarily have to take a sample of, I'll still have the sample of the laptop that they brought in, when they're terminated, but I don't necessarily have to go, okay, well, let's prove that that came off of their phone. It's like, well, once they no longer have access to the Microsoft, that Outlook app is doesn't have access to that system, to that email anymore.
And I'm not in the external assessor game anymore, but when you're having those conversations and you're selecting your auditor, have these conversations, right?
Yeah.
How do you navigate automated evidence collection? And
Right.
I think it's important that they understand, how to go about that, what the most efficient way is, so there's no surprises, when you get into the weeds of the audit.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. We're a little bit over time. Next week, we're back open discussion. And then September 11th, we've got Stephen Dufour and Jeremy Hooval from HITRUST to talk about going through an AI compliance, a HITRUST AI compliance assessment. So you don't want to miss that. Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.